Welcome back, everyone. We'll now have a two-part panel discussion on political participation and women's legal and social rights. We'll start with a research presentation. Each of the panels will start with a research presentation to foreground the conversation on political participation before turning to the panelists for comments. We'll have 30 minutes for that before an open Q&A discussion with the participants. So it's now just to introduce all the panelists. Ms. Khavar Mumtaz is a Pakistani women's rights activist, author, and a university lecturer. She's the former chairperson of the National Commission for the Status of Women, who served for 2 consecutive terms from 2013 to 2019. During her tenure, NSCW's work focused systematically on a number of areas, including on women's economic participation, violence against women, and women's political participation. NSCW's specific initiatives to improve participation, including the monitoring of the general elections in 2013 and 18, and with a focus on women's turnouts, establishments of an early warning system in the low voter turnout regions for the 2018 elections. She's also worked to improve women's social and political rights, and the organization the commission became involved with drafting legislation related to rape, honor killing, and domestic violence. Ms. Mumtaz is also the recipient of the Prime Minister's Award for Women of Pakistan. She's joining us online. Ms. Mumtaz Mughal is currently working as director for the programs at Aurat Foundation in Islamabad. She leads a number of political participation projects with over 18 years of experience as a women's rights activist and development practitioner. You work closely with provincial governments, assemblies, political parties, especially focused on ending violence against women and promoting gender justice. Mr. Adnan Shaukat Ali is currently serving as Deputy Director, Training and Research and Evaluation of the Election Commission of Pakistan. He served in different key positions, including the Deputy Registrar of the Election Tribunal, the District Election Commissioner at Narowal and Sialkot. In addition, you've also been deputed to sensitive assignments. You also publish extensively and have participated in different international conferences on various subjects. Mohammad Wahid Iqbal Sahab, who's the director of the Gender Management Information Systems at PCSW, is joining us, and he will join us on stage for the second panel. Ms. Saima Liaquat Ali Khan is Senior Group Head at the Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Fund with more than 2 decades of experience in the international human rights and development sector with a focus on program design and evaluation and monitoring. She also joins us online. So let me turn now to Sarah Khan. Sarah is an assistant professor at the Department for Political Science at Yale University, where she researches gender and comparative politics. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And thank you to all of the panelists who've made time to engage with the research. So what I'm going to do for the next 10 minutes is highlight some of the specific findings from research that has been conducted at IDEAS by myself and co-authors, as well as in collaboration with other organizations, and lay out the agenda for a future project on political participation. So the 2 projects that I want to talk about, the first of those deals with findings from a study of women's voter turnout in the 2018 general elections. This was conducted by myself and Drs. Ali Chima, Asad Liaquat, and Shandana Khan Momand in partnership with Aurat Foundation and South Asia Partnership of Pakistan. It was funded by the FCDO and United States Institute of Peace, and with generous support and advice from ECP, NCSW, and PCSW. And the future research that we're planning is with the same collaborators.
Recording in progress.
Again, in partnership with Aurat Foundation, and this is funded by the Evidence and Governance and Policy Network. Thank you. So the question that we ask in the first research study has to do with the gender gap in women's turnout. We ask first what explains, and secondly, how it is that we can close this gender gap in women's voter turnout. The first step that we undertake in this study is one of measurement. And it's one that's made possible because of the publicly available gender disaggregated turnout data at the polling level that was made available from the 2018 elections by the ECP. And through this, we're able to see that in the 2018 general elections, 11 million fewer women than men turned out to vote. One of the interesting and slightly unexpected patterns that we document in this analysis is that the gender gap in voter turnout is higher in the largest metropolitan cities of each province as compared to the average of the rest of the provinces. So for instance, while the average gender gap nationally was 9%, in Lahore it was about 13%. And this pattern holds across provinces. So the gender gap in voter turnout is higher in Peshawar than the rest of KP, higher in Karachi than the rest of Sindh, higher in Quetta than the rest of Balochistan. Doing this made us want to focus on this issue in the urban context of Lahore, and that's where our study took place. There are a number of theoretical explanations in the political science literature for the gender gap. These range from individual level factors that are pertinent to individual women in terms of resources, information, engagement, and interest, gender gaps in mobilization by political parties that tend to focus their outreach on male voters, long-term cultural norms, and then another factor which we document through our qualitative and quantitative work of male gatekeeping. And male gatekeeping of women's political participation exhibits in a number of ways and should be thought of as a spectrum of behaviors. So we can think of the very extreme cases of there being bans on women's voting, which Aurat Foundation has done a lot of work and advocacy on. But then there are also these everyday, more mundane actions of gatekeeping that are about granting or denying permission to women to leave the house for any action, be it political participation, seeking healthcare, and it could also be the control of resources that are necessary for women's participation, like means of transport, access to information, or even time. And so when we talk about gatekeeping, we're not necessarily talking about bans or denying women the opportunity to participate. It can also simply mean controlling the means by which they're able to participate. So before the 2018 election, the Ideas Survey Wing undertook a survey with men and women in 2,500 households across 500 wards in 94 union councils of Lahore. And we did indeed find empirical evidence of gender gaps in political knowledge. So for instance, we know that the 2018 elections happened according to a new delimitation. Only 40% of the men in our sample knew about the fact that there was going to be a new delimitation, but about half of those women knew about the new delimitation. There was also a gap in knowing that national and provincial elections are on the same day. And something that Aurat Foundation's work has documented is sometimes that women will waste their provincial vote. And so we see sort of parallels in the anecdotes and the observations that advocacy groups have done at the polling station and the knowledge that we document, the gender gaps in knowledge that we document through these surveys. We also see gaps in reported interest in politics, whether women and men consider themselves to be well-informed about politics, and whether they've been approached by political parties and partisan actors to come out to vote. We also find evidence of the kind of male gatekeeping that I talked about, but it's different from what you might expect, right? So in Lahore, at least, there's broad consensus that voting is an appropriate thing for women to do. This might not be true in other parts of the country, right, where we see bans on women's voting. That's not the case in Lahore. But in Lahore, 60% of adult women report that they have to seek a household member's permission to leave the house. We also document that in our sample in Lahore, 92% of households have a motorbike. But we know from ownership data that that ownership of the bike is predominantly male. So given all of this, we designed, along with Aurat Foundation and SAP PK, women's voter mobilization campaigns that were run across 1,500 households. These campaigns had a number of components. The first was a non-partisan introduction, which was accompanied by a letter from the ECP endorsing the activity of non-partisan mobilization. A 5-minute video of showing a woman through sort of the decision of politically participating and casting a vote. Informational leaflets which draw on research and work that Aurat Foundation, SAP PK, and the Election Commission have done. So showing the process of how to cast your vote, and then a mock ballot activity which actually takes people in the household through the process of casting their vote, where to put a mark, how to look for the political party's symbols. I will let Mumtaz speak more to this during her presentation, but this represented a shift in the way that these organizations generally conduct their campaigns from community-level events to household-level, door-to-door mobilization. And the randomized component of this, which was the field experimental component, was in whether we targeted men, women, or both in the households that we were studying. So this is just showing you that experimental design. There were a number of households which were in the control condition, did not receive any mobilization visit. A portion of them received only a visit from a female mobilizer targeted to women voters in the household. Some of the households received a visit from a male mobilizer to mobilize men in the household. And when I say mobilize men about the importance of women's vote. So the outcome and the eventual sort of goal that we're interested in is women's turnout. And then there was a fraction of the households where both men and women received a visit from a male and female mobilizer, respectively. The measurement of turnout was another activity that this whole project really hinged on, because we couldn't rely on survey measures of turnout, since those tend to be really unreliable. So the IDEA survey wing actually visited the sample households in the 2 days following the election, asking people to voluntarily show the ink mark, which is put at the polling station or the polling booth when, at the time of voting. So using that, we were able to calculate the household level female voter turnout. So the statistics on male and female voter turnout are, of course, the lowest level of aggregation is the polling booth level, but we wanted a household level measure of this. So when we did this, the findings that we had was that in households where only women received mobilization visits, we actually don't see an increase in the level of women's voter turnout. In households where only men and not women were visited, we actually do see a difference in women's turnout of around 5 to 6 percentage points. So this sort of goes back, I think, to Rachel's presentation about sometimes you can have really unexpected results, right? I mean, most gender programs tend to focus on women. Here we're able to show that actually to improve an outcome related to women, focusing on men is what makes a difference. The largest effects, however, were the ones where we had visited both men and women in the household, where there was an increase in women's turnout of about 8 percentage points. We also collected data on other survey-based outcomes that I'll move past those in the interest of time. But I want to kind of note that this study sort of shows that even though there are deep-rooted constraints to women's participation in the public sphere, in this case, it was possible to make a change through a 20-minute simple intervention. And perhaps this was possible because there was pre-existing consensus that voting is actually an appropriate activity for women. If we're thinking about an act of participation that requires a change in attitudes, then perhaps a longer-term engagement would be possible. So drawing on this research, we put together a general framework for assessing the scope for short-term change. In cases where we think there are permissive attitudes and norms towards women's participation, and men's actions are not required to enable it, here we think it's not necessarily important to engage men, and directly targeting women might be able to make a change. However, if men's attitudes are permissive, but they're also controlling the resources like transport or time required for women's participation, then short-term change may still be possible, but only if men are engaged. And finally, if attitudes and norms are restrictive, then this is where short-term change is unlikely. This is where we think a 20-minute intervention may not be enough. This is where you might need something like a longer-term engagement. So there's some related publications, academic and policy, from this work that are coming out, and the links to those are on the IDEA's website. But I want to just briefly highlight the next direction that this research is going, which is beyond electoral participation and thinking about women's mobilization to participate in consultative processes to improve public services. This is again being undertaken in partnership with Aurat Foundation. It's part of a multi-country study across 5 country contexts. And here we're looking at what happens when women's action committees are created at the local level. So Aurat Foundation is going to be mobilizing to do this across those same union councils. We're going to be creating 180 women's action committees. Those committees are going to receive information about how to participate in local government processes. And they will be given contacts to relevant local government departments and services. And a random half of those are going to receive an intensive training program that highlights the recognition of shared demands and a shared identity as women. They're going to eventually participate in a competitive community grants proposal and process. This is very much an intervention that we're getting off the ground and designing, and so it's going to be incredibly valuable to draw on the experience of all the panelists today about how we can take this work forward, and I thank you very much for engaging with it.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Ms. Mumtaz, I'll just turn to you to share your experience and insights from the project.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarah, or IDEAS, or Dr. Rabia, and Center for Economic Research colleagues. I make the presentation on women's political participation. When I saw the concept note, I prepared, but thinking I just skip up some slides because for time constraint. So I also excuse, I am not good English speaker, so I will present my action plans for study, next studies, and this the feedback of this study in Urdu. So औरत फाउंडेशन जो है निगार आपा ने जब स्टार्ट किया तो एक दो जो सारा ने जिस स्टडी से स्टार्ट किया नॉलेज गैप की जो बात की तो उनका कहना ये था कि हमें औरतों को मालूमात के साथ इक्विप करना है। जब तक हम ख़वातीन को मालूमात नहीं देंगे, ख़वातीन को मालूमात के हवाले से एम्पावर नहीं करेंगे, हम तरक्की नहीं कर सकते। दूसरा उनका जो मोटिव था वो ये था कि जब तक हमारी औरतें सियासत में नहीं होंगी, ऐवानों में नहीं बैठेंगी, तो हम अपने मुल्क की तरक्की की बात नहीं कर सकते। तो हम औरतों की पाकिस्तान में जो औरतों की सियासी अमल में शिरकत है, इसके हवाले से थोड़ा सा एक ओवरव्यू मैं आपको देती हूँ और फिर हम इस स्टडी पे दोबारा से आते हैं। तो मैं रिक्वेस्ट करूँगी कि प्लीज़ आप इसको गो थ्रू कर जी। अगर हम पाकिस्तान में 1947 से 2018 तक अगर हम जनरल कॉन्टेक्स्ट में देखें कि जनरल इलेक्शन में ख़वातीन की पार्टिसिपेशन क्या रही, तो जो 1970 का जो इलेक्शन था, हम देखते हैं कि उसमें 9 ख़वातीन जो हैं 9 वमेन ने कॉन्टेस्ट किया इलेक्शन, और कोई भी खातून जो है इलेक्शन विन नहीं कर सकी। फिर हम 1977 में आते हैं, वहाँ पे एक खातून जो है उन्होंने डायरेक्ट जनरल इलेक्शन पे इलेक्शन कॉन्टेस्ट किया और उन्होंने इसको विन किया, और 216 का जो मेल का हाउस था उसमें सिर्फ एक खातून जो है वो जनरल सीट पे जो है असम्बली में हमारी रिप्रेजेंटेटिव के तौर पे मौजूद थी। 1985 में 15 ख़वातीन को मौका मिला जनरल इलेक्शन कॉन्टेस्ट करने का, और सिर्फ एक खातून जो है वो इलेक्शन को विन कर सकी। 1988 में जो है ख़वातीन जब इलेक्शन हुए जनरल इलेक्शन, तो 16 ख़वातीन को जो है इलेक्शन में कॉन्टेस्ट करने का मौका मिला, और सिर्फ 3 ख़वातीन जो हैं वो इलेक्शन जो है विन कर सकें। 90 के इलेक्शन में हम देखते हैं कि सिर्फ 12 ख़वातीन जो हैं उन्होंने इलेक्शन कॉन्टेस्ट किया, और 20 ख़वातीन जो हैं वो उन्होंने इलेक्शन को जो है अपना स्केयर किया। 1993 میں ہم اگر آتے ہیں تو تھوڑا سا آگے کیجیے گا ذرا اس کو نیکسٹ کیجیے گا سلائڈ. 14 خواتین کو موقع ملا اور بہت کم تعداد میں خواتین جو ہے وہ آس کی. 1997 کا جب جنرل الیکشن ہوتا ہے تو 35 خواتین جو ہیں وہ جنرل سیٹوں پہ الیکشن لڑتی ہیں, لیکن 5 خواتین جو ہے الیکشن کو ون کر سکتی ہیں. 2000 جو کہ پاکستان کی ہسٹری میں اور خواتین کی وومنس پولیٹیکل پارٹیسپیشن کی جو ہسٹری ہے اس میں بہت اہم جو ہے ایئر ہے, سال ہے, جس میں خواتین کو موقع ملا. اور 2000 میں جو خواتین نے جو ہے 342 کا جو ہاؤس تھا اس میں 57 وومن جو ہے انہوں نے الیکشن جنرل نشستوں پہ کانٹیسٹ کیا اور صرف 13 خواتین جو ہیں وہ ون کر سکیں. 2008 میں ہم آتے ہیں جس میں جو ہے خواتین جو ہے انہوں نے 64 خواتین جو ہیں, ہم دیکھ رہے ہیں کہ گریجولی جیسے جیسے الیکشن آتے جا رہے ہیں خواتین کو موقع ملتا جا رہا ہے اور خواتین جو ہے الیکشن لڑتی آ رہی ہیں. تو 64 خواتین جو ہیں انہوں نے جنرل الیکشن جو ہے ان کو کانٹیسٹ کیا اور 16 خواتین جو ہیں الیکشن جیت کر اسمبلیوں میں آئیں. اور اسی وقت میں جو ہے ہمارے پاس جو 2000 میں جو کی اسمبلی تھی اس میں 60 خواتین ریزرو سیٹ پہ بھی آ گئی. تو ہمارے پاس اوور آل 76 خواتین پاکستان کی ہسٹری میں پہلی مرتبہ جو ہے جنرل نشستوں میں جنرل الیکشن کے طور پہ جو ہے وہ ریزرو اور جنرل نشستوں پہ جو ہے وہ موجود ہوئی, اور 22% جو ہے خواتین کی نمائندگی ہاؤس میں ہوئی. 2013 میں ہم دیکھتے ہیں 61 خواتین نے جنرل نشستوں پہ الیکشن لڑتی ہیں اور صرف 9 خواتین جو ہیں الیکشن جیت سکی ہیں. اور 2018 کا الیکشن جو ہے اس میں 18 خواتین جو ہیں وہ الیکشن کو انہوں نے ون کیا. تھوڑا سا آگے نیکسٹ. اچھا, یہ ایک اوور ویو ہے کہ خواتین کو جنرل الیکشنز کے دوران کس طرح سے جو ہے موقع ملا. تو ہم دیکھتے ہیں کہ 15 ہمارے جو ہے الیکشن ہوئے, جو ہماری 15 لیجسلیٹو اسمبلیز تھیں اس میں جو ہماری 13 لیجسلیٹو اسمبلی تھی اس میں خواتین کی ریشو جو ہے ہمیں نظر آتی ہے 22%. ادروائز ہم اوور آل پاکستان بننے سے لے کے اب تک دیکھیں تو کہیں ہمارا سفر جو ہے آ کے جو ہے وہ 14 جو ہماری اسمبلی تھی وہاں پہ 21% آتا ہے, لیکن پھر ہمارا 18 میں جو ہے 90% پہ چلا جاتا ہے. یہ کچھ خواتین کی جنرل صورتحال ہے جنرل الیکشن میں پارٹیسپیٹ کرنے کی. نیکسٹ ہم جاتے ہیں تو لوکل پولیٹیکل پارٹیز کا جو ٹرینڈ رہا ہے. اگر ہم 2008 اور 2013 اور 2018 کے الیکشن دیکھتے ہیں تو پی ایم ایل جو ہے انہوں نے 7 خواتین کو جنرل نشستوں پہ ٹکٹ دیا. پیپلز پارٹی نے 15 خواتین کو دیا, جبکہ پی ٹی آئی نے کسی الیکشن کا بائیکاٹ کیا. 2013 کا الیکشن دیکھتے ہیں تو 6 خواتین کو پی ایم ایل این نے ٹکٹ دیا جنرل نشستوں پہ اور 13 خواتین کو پیپلز پارٹی نے دیا اور پی ٹی آئی نے 6 خواتین کو دیا. 2018 کا جو ریسنٹ الیکشن تھا اس میں پی ایم ایل این نے 5 خواتین کو ٹکٹ دیے, پیپلز پارٹی نے 12 خواتین کو دیا اور پی ٹی آئی نے 14 خواتین کو دیا. تو یہ ہمارے ہاں پولیٹیکل پارٹیز کی صورتحال ہے خواتین کو الیکشن میں ایز اے لیڈر دیکھنے کی, ایز اے کانٹیکسٹ جنرل الیکشن سیٹوں پہ کانٹیکسٹ کرنے کے حوالے سے ان کا جو مائنڈ سیٹ ہے وہ ہمیں یہاں پہ نظر آتا ہے. پاکستان پیپلز پارٹی جو ہے وہ ڈیفینیٹلی اس میں لیڈ کر رہی ہے عورتوں کو جنرل سیٹوں پہ بھی لے کے آنے کے لیے. نیکسٹ پلیز. جو ہم ریپرزنٹیشن اور پارٹیسپیشن کی بات کریں تو ابھی تک ہم دیکھتے ہیں کہ خواتین جو ہے 4.7% جو ہے وہ سکیور کر سکی ہیں اپنے جو اوور آل جتنے بھی الیکشن ہم دیکھتے ہیں مردوں کے مقابلے میں خواتین کا جو ہے ہم دیکھتے ہیں. ایک اچھی جو ڈیولپمنٹ ہوئی نیشنل کمیشن آن دا اسٹیٹس آف وومن, اور یہ اس طرح کے انسٹیٹیوشنز موجود تھے, سول سوسائٹی موجود تھی, وومن لیڈرز موجود تھیں, وومن لیڈر گروپس موجود تھے, وومن رائٹ ایکٹیوسٹ موجود تھیں. تو جو ہماری اسٹرگل جو ہے 1986 سے جو ہم کرتے آ رہے تھے اس کے نتیجے میں ہم نے دیکھا ہے کہ پرائیویٹ ممبر بل کے طور پہ جو ہے جنرل فرسٹ ٹائم جو ہے ایک پرائیویٹ ممبر بل کے طور پہ جو ہے خواتین کو کا بل ٹیبل ہوا جس میں خواتین کو جنرل نشستوں پہ پارٹیوں کو باؤنڈ کیا گیا کہ وہ خواتین کو جو ہے 5% جو ہے وہ کوٹا فکس کریں گی اپنا ٹکٹ دینے کے حوالے سے. نیکسٹ. اسی طرح لوکل گورنمنٹ میں ہم دیکھتے ہیں کہ 2000 میں جب خواتین کو موقع ملتا ہے اور 33% ریپرزنٹیشن جو ہے وومن کی جو ہے وہ انشور کی جاتی ہے, تو ہم دیکھتے ہیں کہ اراؤنڈ 1 لاکھ کے قریب خواتین جو ہیں خواتین الیکشن لڑتی ہیں، باہر آتی ہیں اور وہ اس مت کو توڑتی ہیں کہ سیاست کرنا جو ہے صرف مردوں کا کام نہیں ہے. اتنی بڑی تعداد میں خواتین کا باہر نکل کے آنا اور خواتین کا الیکشن لڑنا جو ہے یہ پاکستان کی ہسٹری میں ایک اس پیٹریارکل مائنڈ سیٹ کو اور اس مت کو توڑنے کا سبب بنتا ہے. اور یہ کریڈٹ جاتا ہے عورت فاؤنڈیشن اور ان کی پارٹنر آرگنائزیشنز کو. اس میں شرکت گاہ ہو، اس میں اثر ہو، اس میں ہماری سول سوسائٹی کے آرگنائزیشن ہوں، ہمارے سول ایکٹیوسٹ ہوں، مرد ہوں. ان لوگوں نے یہ کوشش کر کے خواتین کی جو پہلی مرتبہ جو سیٹیں تھیں 33% سیٹیں مختص کی گئی تھیں، وہ اس کو فل کرنے کے لیے جو ہے عورت فاؤنڈیشن اور ان کے ساتھی آرگنائزیشنز نے پاکستان بھر میں موبلائزیشن کمپین کی. اس موبلائزیشن کمپین کے نتیجے میں 1,00,000 خواتین کو جو ہے الیکشن میں کانٹیسٹ کرنے کا موقع ملا. اور اس میں ہم تھینکفل ہیں الیکشن کمیشن آف پاکستان نے، جس نے بہت زیادہ اسپیس کریٹ کی سول سوسائٹی کے لیے کہ انہوں نے ہم جیسے اداروں کو سسٹر آرگنائزیشن کہا اور اس سارے الیکشن کے پروسیس کو جو ہے سپورٹ کیا. اور پاکستان میں پہلی مرتبہ جو ہے 36,000 خواتین جو ہیں وہ الیکشن لڑ کے آئیں اور انہوں نے خواتین کی ریزرو سیٹ پہ کمیونٹی میں جا کے ڈور ٹو ڈور الیکشن کانٹیکسٹ کیا اور اسی طرح سے کانٹیکسٹ کیا جس طرح سے ہمارے ہاں جنرل الیکشن میں مرد کانٹیکسٹ کرتے ہیں یا جنرل سیٹوں پہ کرتے ہیں. خواتین کی سیٹیں ریزرو تھیں لیکن الیکشن ان کے ڈائریکٹ تھے، جس کے نتیجے میں 36,000 خواتین پاکستان کی تاریخ میں جو ہے الیکشن لڑ کے آئیں. اور پھر اس جو مت کو ہم نے توڑا، لیکن اس کے نتیجے میں ہوا کیا، ایک چیلنج آیا کہ اتنی خواتین تھی، اچھا غریب گھروں کی خواتین آ گئی ہیں، فلاں طرح کی خواتین آ گئی ہیں، خواتین اپنے کام کو ڈاکومنٹ نہیں کر سکیں، جس کے نتیجے میں ریپرزنٹیشن تو 33% کی گئی لیکن سیٹیں کم کر دی گئیں خواتین کی، جس کے نتیجے میں جو ہے 2005 میں ہم دیکھتے ہیں کہ خواتین نے الیکشن لڑا لیکن خواتین کی تعداد 12,000 سم تھنگ خواتین جو ہیں وہ آئی. اور وہی ٹرینڈ خواتین کو سیاست میں روکنے کے حوالے سے جو چلتا ہوا آ رہا ہے، اور اب ہم دیکھ رہے ہیں کہ لوکل گورنمنٹ کے جو ابھی نئے لاز آ رہے ہیں وہاں بھی خواتین کی 33% نمائندگی کو کم بھی کیا جا رہا ہے اور ان کو روکنے کے لیے کہیں مخصوص سیٹوں کی صورت میں لا رہے ہیں کہ کہیں پہ جو ہے ان کی سیٹیں کم کر دی جا رہی ہیں. تو اس سچویشن کو بھی ہم نے آگے دیکھنا ہے. جی اس پہ میں زیادہ بات نہیں کروں گی، ڈاکٹر سارہ نے اس پہ کافی جو ہے بات کی ہے. جو ہمارے ہاں پولیٹیکل خواتین کی سیاسی عمل میں جو پولیٹیکل جو بیریئرز ہیں پولیٹیکل پارٹیسپیشن کے، لیکن اس میں 1-2 چیزوں کو ضرور ہائی لائٹ کروں گی جس میں اکاؤنٹیبلٹی جو ہے، انکلوژن جو ہے، اس کو ہمیں جو ہے آگے مزید دیکھنا ہے. جو ابھی ڈاکٹر سارہ اگلی اسٹڈی جو ہے وہ اس میں کر رہے ہوں گے، شاید اس میں کہیں پہ ہم اس چیزوں کو بھی دیکھ رہے ہوں گے. اور جو گورنمنٹ کے ساتھ انگیجمنٹ ہے اور اکاؤنٹیبلٹی کے کانٹیکسٹ میں اس کو بھی ہم اس میں دیکھ رہے ہوں گے. تو یہ کچھ چیزیں ہیں. تھوڑا آگے سوری جی بالکل، میں تھوڑا کرٹیکل نیڈز کیا ہیں اس ساری خواتین کی پولیٹیکل پارٹیسپیشن کو امپروو کرنے کے لیے. تو ہمیں یہ لگتا ہے کہ جو جینڈر گیپ ہے اس کے لیے نادرا اور جو الیکشن کمیشن جو ہے اس کو زیادہ کام کرنے کی ضرورت ہے، سول سوسائٹی کو انگیج کرتے ہوئے کہ وہ جینڈر گیپ کو اس کو کم کریں. اس کے ساتھ ساتھ 2017 کا جو الیکشن ایکٹ ہے اس کو بھی امینڈ کرنے کی ضرورت ہے. اور وہ جو اس میں الیکشن کو جو ریزرو سیٹس پہ الیکشن ہے اس کے موڈ کو دیکھنے کی ضرورت ہے کہ وہ کیسے ہم جو ہے خواتین جو ہے وہ ایکسپلائٹ نہ ہوں اور وہ بہتر انداز میں جو ہے الیکشن میں پارٹیسپیٹ کر سکیں. انکلوژن جو ہے اس کو بڑھانے کی ضرورت ہے. اس میں پرسن ود ڈسیبلٹی ہیں، ٹرانسجینڈر کی جو ہے پارٹیسپیشن ہے. اس کے علاوہ جنرل نشستوں پہ بھی ایز ویل ایز لوکل گورنمنٹ کی جو نشستیں ہیں، یوتھ کی نمائندگی جو ہے، جتنی بڑی یوتھ ہے اس کو انگیجمنٹ کی ضرورت ہے. پھر اس کے ساتھ ساتھ جو پولیٹیکل پارٹی یہ جو 5% الیکشن ایکٹ کے اندر کیا گیا، پولیٹیکل پارٹیز کو باؤنڈ کیا گیا ہے، اس کو بڑھانے کی ضرورت ہے. اس کا بھی ہم بہت ساری اسٹڈیز میں امپیکٹ دیکھ رہے ہیں کہ پارٹیاں جو کہ خواتین کو سیاست میں جنرل نشستوں پہ ٹکٹ دے رہی تھیں، انہوں نے 5% کو اس کو استعمال کیا اور خواتین کو اس نام پہ جو ہے زیادہ ٹکٹیں نہیں دیں جو پچھلے الیکشن میں. اور اس میں الیکشن کمیشن جو ہے اس کو بھی دیکھنے کی ضرورت ہے کہ جن پولیٹیکل پارٹیز نے خواتین کو نشستیں جنرل نشستوں پہ ٹکٹ نہیں دیے ان کے خلاف ایکشن جو ہے وہ بہت ضروری ہے کرنا. اس کے ساتھ ساتھ تمام لیول پہ جو ہے 33% نمائندگی جو ہے اس کو دیکھنے کی ضرورت ہے. ایک اور جو جی آگے کرتے جائے जो हमारे यहाँ सीट्स हैं लोकल गवर्नमेंट की, उसको भी हमें जो है बढ़ाने की देने की ज़रूरत, उस पर भी बात करने की ज़रूरत है कि हमारे यहाँ सीट्स जो हैं जो 33% रखें, जो लोकल गवर्नमेंट के अंदर हैं उनको आप कम ना करें, उसको सीट का वॉल्यूम बढ़ाएं कि जहाँ से 26 से शुरू हुई हैं 13 पे आई हैं 8 पे जा रही हैं, तो उसको हम बरकरार रखने की बात करें। इसके साथ साथ जो है फिनंशियल सपोर्ट, इस इशू को एड्रेस करने की ज़रूरत है पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज़ के लेवल पे कि अगर हमने ख़वातीन को सियासत में लाना है तो किस तरह से जो है फिनंशियल सपोर्ट फंड जो है उसको इस्टेब्लिश करने की ज़रूरत है। ख़वातीन की मेन स्ट्रीम पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज़ और उनकी जो कमेटीज़ हैं, उन डिसीजन मेकिंग कमेटीज़ हैं, उसमें ख़वातीन को लाने की ज़रूरत है। और जो यंग लोगों के साथ जो काम है उनकी पार्टिसिपेशन है, उनके लिए पॉलिटिकल एजुकेशन प्रोग्राम जो है वो किस तरह के शुरू करने चाहिए, इस पे काम करने की ज़रूरत है। तो सॉरी डॉक्टर रबिया, टाइम बहुत कम है, लेकिन हम ये देख रहे हैं कि जो काम हम सिविल सोसाइटी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ने बेस्ट प्रैक्टिसेस की सूरत में किया पाकिस्तान में, उसको डॉक्टर सारा और आइडियाज़ ने जिस तरह से टेस्टेड किया और जो उसके सक्सेसफुल नताइज नज़र आए, हमें ये लगता है कि हमें जो नेक्स्ट आप करेंगे तो उसमें मैंने डाला हुआ है कि एकेडेमिया को और रिसर्चर्स को जो है इस पर और काम करने की ज़रूरत है, ताकि वो और ग्लोबल प्रैक्टिसेस को भी हमें डॉक्यूमेंट करने की ज़रूरत है कि किस तरह से हम पाकिस्तान में जो है एक ट्रेडिशनल वे से निकल के हम जो है जो सफ़र हमने शुरू किया था उसको हम किस तरह से आगे लेके जा सकते हैं। बहुत शुक्रिया, सॉरी आपका टाइम लेने के लिए।
Thank you. This was very valuable.
और अभी तो बहुत सारी बातें थी मीडिया के हवाले से भी, और मुझे लग रहा था कि ख़वातीन को जो है ना लिसन और उनके काम को रिकग्नाइज करने के हवाले से जो है अभी बहुत सारी बात करने की ज़रूरत है।
आप प्लीज़ रहिएगा, आप यहीं पे रहिएगा, बिकॉज और सवालात भी हैं। इफ़ आई मे नाउ प्लीज़ टर्न टू मिस खावर रियाज एंड आस्क यू अ फ्यू क्वेश्चंस, मिस रियाज। Khabar Mumtaz, sorry, my apologies. So madam, the idea, an Aurat Foundation, a collaborative study found that there are minimal or no effects of targeting just women, but there's huge effects of including men in the intervention. Given your extensive experience of working on women's political participation, do you find this surprising or unexpected?
Thank you. First of all, I think I really appreciate the fact that some insightful further studies are being taken on women's political participation. And the most surprising thing that came out, of course, was that women in urban areas who have the facility of accessing polling stations don't go there. And the turnout is lower there than in rural areas. So that's an interesting issue to be probed. You know, with a control group in rural areas, for instance, there are some rural areas where more women voters turned out than males. So at some point, I think that would be an interesting thing to see. Is it the gatekeeper mobilizing more for political objectives, or is it there is some other dynamics working there? Because, for instance, there were several constituencies, especially in Sindh, where 22 constituencies across Pakistan where the turnout for women voters was higher than male. And these were all rural constituencies. So it would be interesting at some point when CERP is doing this work to look at that dynamics, what mobilizing. Because I think the most important thing is that across Pakistan, the pre-existing gender discrimination is at play all the time. And participation in elections, while acceptable to most, mobilization becomes more important. But another point that I think you pointed out was the lack of outreach to women by political parties. And interesting, when we were doing the observation in 2018 of elections by the National Commission's members, we developed an exit poll list, randomly asked women who had come to cast their votes some of these questions. And one question which was negative in almost all cases it was spot checking, was that nobody had come to them as women to encourage them to come. They were very enthusiastic, so their enthusiasm was perhaps because of this whole aura of the elections and the discussion and the men talking about it. But most women, almost all women said that they had not been approached. So we can understand your empirical work that CERP did that women said that nobody comes to us to ask us about our issues. And even then, if we get a turnout of whatever it is, even if it's 10% less than men, it's amazing that they do come out and are enthusiastic. So that was what I found the most important and interesting thing, is that I think women are now getting politically aware and want to be reached out and to be listened to. And I think that is what is missing in our system. But of course, there are, as you say very rightly, there are urban-rural differences, provincial differences, age groups also. We don't have any data on or the age groups of the voters. I know we asked the Election Commission if that would be possible, but that's not really possible, they say, because that would also show us the interest of the younger people. Most of our population is youthful. We don't get an assessment of that. So maybe in your control, your house-to-house discussion, you eke out that kind of information. And so that's basically what I find, that a lot of things, as Mumtaz said, that we discovered in our anecdotal manner gets empirically tested and proved, and very important to go into the details of it. I think the other thing I would say, that when Mumtaz laid out what we think needs to be changed, advocacy is very, very important. When we want change, advocacy and with key institutions. I think the advocacy with the Election Commission was very important. And they gave the space to academics, researchers, as well as civil society. And I think it's important that how we advocate, and that advocacy for policy change is extremely important, along with the political leadership, but we also know that is tricky.
Thank you very much.
I don't know how much, but I do have a few thoughts for your future studies, if you want.
Thank you, Ji, and we'll just come back to you. Adnan, if I may ask you to comment, please, on the kinds of connections you see between the various forms of women's political participation and also their empowerment in other domains.
Thank you so much. Firstly, I would like to some ECP's efforts regarding women participation in the political process. The number one, which is the most important, as Mumtaz Mughal highlighted, that some political parties provide the less than 5% reserved seats to their women participants. Basically, it's a legal provision in the Election Act 2017. Every political party is bound to provide the 5% general seats to women participants. And they ensure all these percentage. In each and every year, every calendar year, they have to submit their report, how they contest the intra-party elections, and how they provide the 5% reserves or general seats to the women. And as per my information, all political parties provide the 5% reserved seat to the women. And secondly, the 60% seats is separate, which is reserved for the women in the political process. And then second, the gender gap. Currently, Election Commission of Pakistan identified the block code. Block code is basically the smallest unit where the registered voters number around 1,200 to 1,500. And the Election Commission of Pakistan, collaboration with NADRA, highlighted that block codes in the Pakistan, around 60 districts. They found that where the gender gap is more than 10%. And the Election Commission of Pakistan is currently doing an effort to register the women who are unregistered. Firstly, the Election Commission of Pakistan is target that women, firstly, they make their NIC, and then they automatically register as a voter. And one of the most tremendous efforts of Election Commission of Pakistan, the NADRA charged a fees for NIC. But on the behalf of Election Commission of Pakistan, if women make his first CNIC, then the fees is waived off. And the thirdly, which is the efforts on transgenders. Currently, Election Commission of Pakistan is also add a column in the voter list. That is a TGs, transgenders. They can easily enroll their voter as a transgender, because we conducted several interviews from the transgenders. They are reluctant to show their identity because there are some personal issues, their property rights issues. So most of the time, this time, the Election Commission of Pakistan doing an effort to register them as voters. And one most interesting thing which she highlighted that siyasat mardon ka kaam hai. So as I recently KP local government election phase 2 is today is a poll day of the KP local government, and I still remember 2 weeks ago I visited the agencies Kuram, Aurat, Zai, and you know this is the previous part of the FATA, Federal Administrative Tribal Areas, and that areas where the women are reluctant to cast their votes. And in Kuram, one of the agency, 257 women registered themselves as an candidates for the local government. And it's a very big achievement of the Election Commission of Pakistan. They encourage the women to effectively participate in the political process of Pakistan. And the thirdly and the last regarding the Dr. Sahara, as mentioned about the gender gap in Lahore. As per my observation, because I was posted in District Election Commissioner Narowal and Sialkot, I saw that in rural areas there is a lot of gender gap as compared to the city life. Because in rural areas the women are reluctant to register themselves as an citizen. Even they did not register as an they did not register their NIC. So if they have not NIC, then they did not enroll as a voter. So in all this aspect, the Election Commission of Pakistan doing tremendous efforts to give chance to the women and effectively participate in the political process of Pakistan. Thank you.
May I also ask you to comment on how do you see all of this political participation and the trends and the patterns that you're seeing? How does this link with women's empowerment in other areas?
Basically, first of all, when women participate in the political process, then they raise their voices because they are the marginalized group. And most of the time, when they highlighted the issues which they are facing. For example, recently one of the bill has been passed regarding Harassment Act. Previously, in harassment, there is a no dismissal from the service. Now, recently, amendment from the 2 weeks ago, I read the section where she mentioned if the government servant harassed to his colleague or her colleague, then he will be dismissed from the service. Previously, the suspension is not a dismissal. Suspension and dismissal is a totally different thing. If one person is dismissed, then he cannot join the service again. So I think there is a lot of efforts now this time, the women empowerment in the political process and even in the legislative process as well.
Thank you very much. If I may please call on Samia Liaquat, who's also joining us online. Madam, if you could also comment on how you see women's political participation linking with women's empowerment more generally.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on this panel. I'll go back to the work that PPAF has been doing over the last 20 years, which is where we, within the villages where you look at informal associations, self-help groups coming together of villagers. And since 2009 or 10, we've been looking at inclusion mandates within these informal village groups, where we are trying to ensure the inclusion of women and the most marginalized, the poorest households. And some of the research that we did in one of our World Bank projects was around looking at women's participation within these village organizations. So where women were in power, they were the presidents or the secretaries, etc., and there were women-only village organizations created. They were financed to undertake certain projects for the good of the community. The understanding and the acceptance of women in positions of power, even at the village level, were much more improved. And one of the findings was that attitudes of boys and girls, so of adolescents, towards women in the public space changed because of the way we had sort of created these inclusion mandates and the way women were coming forward at that level. But we also saw that the attitudes of older males remained the same. So I think we do need to understand that addressing men and addressing males as part of the work on women's empowerment is essential. We found, unfortunately also, so that this was part of a broader RCT that we were doing, which spanned around 5 or 6 years. We found that while this was happening during the course of the program being implemented, once the program stopped being implemented and there wasn't that focus on continuing with these village organizations and sustaining them and ensuring that the women were participating equally, that the attitudes of the boys started reverting after a while. And I think what's very essential, and I think my the esteemed panelist from Aurat Foundation, what she's mentioned is that we are in Pakistan, there is always a chance for reversal, that we are constantly battling. You know, we get some gains, but we cannot keep or sustain those gains over the longer term. And I saw this in the presentation where we're looking at just the political participation, how many women, even in the local bodies, what were the number of women that were coming out to be elected, and then, how this is declining, what is happening within the political parties themselves. And so I find that we have a very tenuous hold on sustaining a women's empowerment. And I think for this reason, there has to be a very concentrated focus on changing the mindsets of men. And if we can't change the mindsets of men, we have to focus on youth and on adolescent boys. And I think these are areas of further research that I think we need to do. And maybe this research needs to be linked into the long-term sort of efforts of not only development practitioners, but where government or local bodies are involved. So if you can, if we can create partnerships where local bodies are currently functioning, and that in itself is a whole big question mark, right? Because this is also about inclusion and allowing for the autonomy of local bodies and the existence of local bodies, given the state of our setup, our sort of socio-political setup that we have, that we need to interlink this with projects that focus on youth, focus on girls and boys, but specifically focus on boys in terms of changing mindsets, because I believe that is one way we may be able to sustain future gains. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just keeping an eye on the time, we'd like to open up also to questions from the floor to our panelists and to Sarah. Please.
Thank you very much. So my question is essentially on the study that was undertaken and regarding the gap in the urban areas specifically. Was the intention to cast vote also measured during the study? And also the patterns for men in the urban areas, what was the difference in the number of men voting as compared to the provincial average, or for that matter, the rural average? The reason I ask this is obviously because maybe it is not a gender gap. Obviously the gender gap is there, but one possible explanation could also be that women and men in urban areas also vote with their feet, that is by not voting at all. And that becomes much more of a conscious choice for them whether they want to cast that vote because of a lack of agreement with the political process itself. And in the rural areas, on the other hand, women are bound by the decision of their male households as well, leaders as well. So without whether they actually do want to cast the vote or not, they are asked to by their heads of the household. Thank you.
And so could you also just introduce yourself?
My name is Hamza Ijaz, and I'm Program Officer at US Institute of Peace.
Great, thank you for your question. So this is a study that we're sort of undertaking now, is looking at these rural-urban gaps a little more systematically to understand them. And I think Mr. Sakhawat also pointed to the fact that underlying the turnout gap is also a registration gap. So when we're looking at turnout, that's the number of people who cast their vote divided by the number of registered voters, right? So the rural-urban comparison also has different denominators, And so in rural areas, as he rightly pointed out, the registration gap is potentially higher. Right, so we might be talking about a higher number of urban voters, but a lower rate of turnout. So I think that distinction is also worth kind of mentioning to contextualize what the gap is. We have looked at male turnout, and it's lower in urban areas than it is in rural areas. But women's turnout is lower to the extent that we do see a larger gender gap in urban areas than we do in rural areas. I think one of the hypotheses that we have is that this is also about the nature of mobilization that political parties undertake, which in the rural areas is at a block level. It's much more sort of collective. Whereas in urban areas, it is a door-to-door, household-level mobilization where people get left out. Right? And especially women get left out in a different way. I think it's also important to think about whether we can compare levels, but we should also be thinking about whether a vote that's cast represents an autonomous decision or not, right? So I think this idea that male gatekeepers might in fact be collectively mobilizing women to vote in rural areas is a possibility. So along with levels, I think we have to look at what those numbers mean.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? We also have participants online. If there's any questions, please do raise your hands. And meanwhile, if I may return to Zara, please.
So I did have a question for the panel, and this could be simply my ignorance about, the political science literature. But one of the things I was thinking about during the discussion was that obviously, we have the female voter and we have a female leader. So just thinking about the links between the two. So, do female voters tend to vote for female leaders, and are female leaders actually responsive to the concerns of women? I think is something of which I don't know what it is in the context of Pakistan specifically. I do know about, there is a literature for India in which Esther Duflo has documented that, female leaders are particularly responsive to the needs of women, who they are for whom they can do work. So I'm just wondering what the evidence is about this particular kind of thing in the Pakistani context.
Ms. Mumtaz, may I invite you to address Sarah's question first?
I think that's an important question that Sarah is making. Since I haven't done a study, but I've examined this whole issue quite a bit. What we see, the women leaders who come into parliament, not all of them have come through grassroots work. So they may, in the parliament, they do raise issues that are women's issues and push for legislation which is promoting women's rights and protecting women's rights. And a number of legislation related to women have been, tabled by them and also then taken forward. But at the political mobilization level, as I said earlier, that when we did that exit poll of the women who had come to cast vote, most of them nobody had come to them. The men may have been mobilized because we also looked a week before the election. We went around in the community to see how many corner meetings were being held with women, and there was hardly any, except one nearer the rural district of Lahore, where there was a political party's office which was catering to women's questions. Otherwise, most of these corner meetings and small campaign offices were only full of men. So obviously women's issues raising at a policy level is a different thing. Raising it with the electorate is a different thing. And we see a separation in those. There's a different kind of outreach, because when you're campaigning for the party's manifesto, which has other issues which seem to be more important. You don't see women's home-based workers issues. They may be on the manifesto, you don't see it out there. And I'll just come to another point, which is interesting, that over the years, as Mumtaz Mughal said, things have improved. Women have become more actively participating, have started participating in politics, but their roles are, essentially as voters, to be mobilized at the time of election to cast votes for a political party or a political candidate. Not much say in who the candidate is, not much say, they're not consulted, they're not part of the decision making. The other is in the assemblies also, they're bound by political parties, party lines, and often where they have come together to take forward a women's issue, that's where they do come together. But otherwise, you don't see that kind of leadership amongst the masses, with the exception. There are, of course, exceptions also. So I don't know if I've answered your question.
Thank you. And Ms. Samia, if I may ask you to address
No, thanks.
that.
Sorry, what particularly would you like me to address?
Oh, so Zara's question was around the link between women voters and women leaders, and if from your experience you'd like to speak about that.
Yes. So I will give you a parallel example. Again, we've done some research around, it was around loans, right? Loans for men and women. And there was what we did was we had our researchers went in and did a little communications campaign. So the brochure, there were two types of brochures, right? One where it had 4 or 5 women in different forms of business, right? And the loan was offered up to 1 lakh of rupees, and it was being offered to a set of males and a set of females. Again, this is in rural Punjab, South Punjab. And the second brochure was with males as the, on the cover of that brochure in different economic activities. And so the researchers went and to their treatment groups, and a certain percentage were offered loans, and they were shown the women's only brochure, and a certain percentage were offered loans and shown the male only brochure. And when they did the analysis, they found that a majority of the persons who were shown the women's only brochure declined to take the loan, whereas a higher percentage of both women and men who were shown the male only brochure took the loans. And for us, it was telling because it showed us that society didn't somehow, there was a bit of maybe suspicion, or there was sort of not enough trust in the fact that seeing these women, and you would think that women seeing other women on, engaging in different kinds of economic activities, that they would feel galvanized to say, yes, we can take the loan, and look, other women are doing the same, and we can go about doing the same. And it was the opposite. Now, this is a few years ago, so things have changed to a certain extent. I do think we have a younger generation that is, much more willing and wanting to engage, whether it's political opportunities or economic opportunities. And I think maybe they do look upon women who are in positions, especially in political parties or within the government, women who are in those positions, they look upon them as potentially, they look upon this area as something that they can now maybe engage with, where previously, it was, for them, it was unheard of. But I personally believe that I think there is some forward movement, but I think if we did a similar kind of situation, like sort of an RCT again, I don't believe that our results would change very much. And again, I think this is, again, a social, one of the underlying, as has been sort of now mentioned in a couple of presentations, we, within this country, we are facing some very deep-rooted biases about what women can do, and specifically about what women should do. And a lot of the narrative around what women should do is not helping us. It's still being controlled by the men, and especially by more conservative males, right? So for me personally, I think if we can focus on young, if we can change the mindset of boys at a time when they are able and they're open to having their minds changed, I think that is really where we need to focus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Khabar Mumtaz, you have your hand up, please.
I just thought, because this very interesting discussion going on, it may not be bearing exactly onto your research, but a couple of things that I feel we need to be looking at any other point or now is there's block voting in Punjab especially. Now, where do women feature in that dynamics, and what is the point where they can collectively get out of that, have their point of view included in that block voting process? I mean, I can understand why the block voting, where you try and negotiate, the underprivileged people negotiate, promises from their candidates. So that's one question. And if somehow in your work, if you find out where collectively women are politicized enough to take up their issues with their political representatives, if at the local government level, I think it's more possible. But it would be nice to be, it would be very useful to know what works. The other thing that I think Samia also referred to is defining what women can do and not do. The point is that, with the law which says that 5% of the seats have to be given to women candidates, we saw that even the religious parties who do not believe that women should be participating in the election had to. But what was very disturbing was the fact that they campaign for women without the women's face, sometimes a husband's name, or with an outline of a woman, and not the woman who was going to contest. So they were very openly, while contradicting the spirit of that 5%. So I think those are kind of things that we need to keep in mind. I don't know where they fit in your study. Is very important, very useful, but I think these are dimensions that need to be taken note of, if nothing else.
I just want to give one example because there is an issue between the woman voter and the woman leader. I just highlight one example because Election Commission of Pakistan noted that in one of the area of the KPK, some religious parties are reluctant to cast the women votes in the political process. Then the Election Commission of Pakistan developed their policies. If any polling station where the less than 10% turnout, that the polling will be re-announced. And most of the time, there is 2 polling stations in 2018. There the women participation is less than 10%, and the Election Commission of Pakistan announced the re-polling in that specific polling stations. And resultantly, that religious political parties mobilize the women. Please cast a vote. If you did not cast a vote, then the re-polling will be announced. So most of the time now Election Commission of Pakistan is time by time announce the different policies how to mobilize and encourage the women voters and participate in the political process.
Thank you very much. When we were conducting this study in Lahore, we interestingly find out 2 and 3 things. One, where we run the sensitization campaign, awareness campaign, and we hold the mock exercises how to cast the vote, and where we sensitize to how to contact with your candidate. So when we in those areas where these exercises were done, the turnout was quietly and increased. And these areas where we did not just provide the information and just give the material and did not hold the 2 exercises like candidate networking with the women, because हमने इस सारी स्टडी के दौरान देखा कि जब हमने ख़वातीन को कहा कि आप क्या कोई कैंडिडेट आपके पास आता है, तो उन ख़वातीन का कहना था कि हमारे पास तो कोई कैंडिडेट आता ही नहीं वोट मांगने के लिए, हमारे मर्दों से वो वोट मांग रहे होते हैं, तो हमें ये हम सिर्फ अपने मर्दों के कहने पे ही वोट देते हैं। तो जब हमने ये नेटवर्किंग मीटिंग्स उनको तैयार किया कि आप अपने कैंडिडेट, अब जब कैंडिडेट आए अपने मर्दों के साथ, तो वो ख़वातीन के साथ भी मीटिंग्स करें, तो जब मीटिंग्स वाले इलाकों में हमने देखा कि वहाँ पे टर्नआउट बेहतर था, ख़वातीन ने अपने मसाइल उनके साथ उनको बताए भी, और जब रिज़ल्ट हमने देखा तो वो टर्नआउट हुआ बानिस्बत उस एरिया के जहाँ पे ये एक्टिविटीज़ जो है ना हो सकी। तो ये जो डिस्कनेक्ट है और या जो इस तरह की जो बेस्ट प्रैक्टिसेस हैं, आई थिंक हमें इसको भी प्रमोट करने की ज़रूरत है अपने इन इलाकों के इनके साथ कि ख़वातीन का जो जनरल इलेक्शन में तो एक दफ़ा 2 दफ़ा से ज़्यादा उनका रब्ता ही नहीं हो पाता कैंडिडेट के साथ, और लोकल गवर्नमेंट इलेक्शन के दौरान फिर भी जो है उनके एक्सेस में होते हैं। और उन्होंने ये भी बताया कि हम वोट इसलिए भी समटाइम नहीं डालते और या सिर्फ मर्दों के कहने पे डालती हैं कि उसके बाद हमें पता ही नहीं होता, कभी उनसे दोबारा मुलाकात भी नहीं होती। तो इस तरह के ट्रेंड्स भी हमने इस स्टडी में देखे हैं। थैंक यू।
Dr. Rabe, we have a question from a participant.
Oh, sorry. I'm just trying to keep. Sarah, are we good to go until 4 and then start the panel at 4?
Maybe we'll take the
last question, please.
Thank you so much. So Sarah, this question I think is directed at you, but you know other panelists are also welcome to answer. So you know, your first slide is what has stuck with me, and I'm just wondering, you know, you talk about this this gap being higher in the metropolitan areas, gap in the voter turnout, and I'm just thinking, what role does political knowledge or, you know, interest in the voting process itself has to do with, you know, why women's representation is so low? And so in your work, have you ever come across that being as, you know, one of the major determinants for why this gender gap is there? And then, you know, if that is the case, what do you suggest can be done to mitigate this gap? How can this political knowledge be increased? How can this interest, if there is a lack of interest, how can this be, you know, addressed? So what I'm thinking is that, you know, can these activities be somehow made part of, you know, curricula? These things could be taught at schools or university levels, so that, you know, women are made aware of these things and this gap can somehow be addressed. Thank you.
We have another question, so should we just pair it all together, please?
So I have a related comment, and it's a thought. Sarah, you mentioned a gap in political knowledge, and that got me thinking about, you know, having access to the kind of knowledge that you need to make an informed decision, an informed vote. And that just got me thinking, is it because, you know, women are less interested in politics, or is it because, like, they don't have access to resources that provide that kind of knowledge? So, because, I mean, you know, men, for instance, most of the women, they have to bear the triple burden, and which means they don't have a lot of time on their hands to sit and scour the newspaper to see what the op-eds are saying, or what the, you know, the political discourse is, or what the discussion is, or you know, what the different political parties are doing or debating about. So yeah, it's just a thought. Is it because, you know, men have more time, or is it male privilege to be more politically informed? Yeah. It's just,
Thank you. So I'll take both those questions together and just speak to this, this issue of a gender gap in political interest and knowledge, right? So I think the way that we measure that gap is also gendered, right? So when we ask questions about political knowledge, often they're about procedural knowledge. And when we look at sort of knowledge of services and local public goods and service delivery in communities, which is also an important aspect of politics, right? We see a lower gender gap there. So I think what's underlying gender gaps in political knowledge and interest is that politics is a very masculine and masculinized field, right? So if we look at one way that we pick this up is we ask women whether they listen to TV talk shows. We're all familiar with the usual format, right? At most, it'll be moderated by a woman, but it's mostly male participants. I think Khaber Mumtaz had pointed out about the corner meetings that are held before elections. Those are mostly all male spaces. So there's not a space for women to participate, and there's a huge gap in mobilization. So what Ms. Mumtaz Mughal pointed out about women in our study saying that the candidates are not talking to them. So why would we expect women to be interested in politics, right? So I think there's a reason why we see that gap. And the change doesn't have to do with just making a change in women's individual interest. It has to do with kind of changing the masculinized nature of politics itself, because without that, there's little incentive for women to be interested.